Hello, and welcome to your lecture on the brain. In this section, we're only going to talk about the major brain regions, and we'll spend some time talking about the cerebral cortex and higher functions. So the major brain regions are listed here, but let's take a look at a picture while we talk about these. So here's a lateral view of the brain, and what we're mostly seeing are two brain parts, the cerebrum and the cerebellum. If we were to take the human brain and cut it into right and left halves, what we call a mid-sagittal section, and then looked at the inside, we would see something like this. So this is a mid-sagittal cut. Let's take a look at this in more detail. All right, so this area here is the cerebrum. Okay. Down here is the cerebellum again. Okay. The diencephalon is a part of the brain that involves the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So this area right here is the thalamus, and this area down here is the hypothalamus. Okay. And then we have the brainstem, which is right here. The brainstem has three parts: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So we're going to start at the bottom and work our way up. So the medulla oblongata is the most inferior part of the brain. It's continuous with the spinal cord below it and the pons above it. In terms of its structure, it contains many nuclei and tracts. We've used the word nucleus in many different ways in our class so far. The nucleus was the center of an atom, it was a part of a cell that contained DNA, and now we're going to use nucleus in a different way. When it comes to brain anatomy, a nucleus is referring to a group of neuron cell bodies that are working together for a particular function. They might be processing information about heart rate, or maybe they're controlling breathing, but it's a group of neuron cell bodies that are doing something together. And that's a little different from something called a tract. A tract is more like a nerve. It's a bundle of axons that are relaying information from one location to another. So whereas a nucleus is going to process information and maybe control an activity, a tract is just simply sending information from one place to another. And we find both of these things in the medulla oblongata. Like many parts of the nervous system, the medulla oblongata exhibits something called decussation, which means that there's a crossover from the right to the left side. In terms of functions, the functions of the medulla oblongata apply directly to the fact that it contains nuclei and tracts. So the tract portion of the medulla oblongata is relaying information up to higher brain areas and down to lower areas. It says lower brain areas on there, but it really should be lower brain areas because there's nothing below the medulla oblongata that is brain. So lower areas would be like the spinal cord. For functions of the medulla oblongata, the functions relate directly to the fact that the medulla oblongata contains nuclei and tracts. The tracts of the medulla oblongata are relaying information up to higher brain areas and down lower to places like the spinal cord. On my slide here it says down lower to lower brain areas, but that's not correct because there is no part of the brain that's below the medulla oblongata. Also, the medulla oblongata functions to coordinate many complex autonomic activities. It's a major autonomic control center, and that's where the nuclei come into play. So these groups of neuron cell bodies are doing things like maybe controlling heart rate, or controlling blood pressure, or controlling respiratory rate, or controlling vomiting. So here's a picture of the medulla oblongata, and what I like about this picture is that the little colored areas in the picture are representing the idea of a nucleus. Like, for example, in red right here, we see the cardiovascular center nucleus. And as the name suggests, the neuron cell bodies here are helping to regulate cardiovascular function. In purple, we have a respiratory rhythmicity center. This particular nucleus is controlling the rhythm of breathing. The next brain area is the pons. The pons is located just above the medulla oblongata. It's located anterior to the cerebellum, and the location is important because one of the main jobs of the pons is to communicate with the cerebellum. The pons links the cerebellum with the rest of the nervous system. Like the medulla oblongata, the pons does contain several nuclei and tracts, and most of these are involved with processing and relaying information to and from the cerebellum. Other than that, the pons also does have a respiratory control center. So like the medulla oblongata, the pons also has a respiratory control center. And the pons and the medulla oblongata both work together to help control respiratory function. Next is the midbrain, which is sometimes referred to as the mesencephalon. The midbrain is the most superior portion of the brain stem. In terms of its function, it has a lot of different unrelated complicated functions. And there's really too much to go into any detail here. One of the things that the midbrain does is that it controls visual and auditory reflexes. Have you ever caught something through the corner of your eye and then you turned your head and automatically looked at it? That's an example of a visual reflex. Or maybe if you're trying to listen to someone and their voice is getting quieter, you might automatically turn your ear to try to hear them better. That would be an example of an auditory reflex. There's an area in the midbrain that's highly involved with this, and it's called the corpora quadrigemina. I think I just like to say that word a lot. It's these little bumpy areas here at the back of the midbrain. And another thing to mention about the midbrain is that it does have the potential to make lots and lots of the neurotransmitter dopamine, suggesting functions with possible motor control. So here we have the cerebellum. Okay. Here's the cerebellum in a sagittal view and a superior view. The cerebellum works very closely with the cerebral cortex. I've heard the analogy before that the cerebellum is kind of like the vice president, and then the cerebral cortex would be like the president. So the cerebellum works very closely with the cerebral cortex to help get several different functions done. One of the main jobs of the cerebellum is to fine-tune conscious and subconscious muscle movements. So the cerebellum helps with all of our internal programming for things like precise movements and accuracy and timing. You know, the fact that you can pick up a pencil and write out words is involving your cerebellum quite a bit. Playing an instrument would involve the cerebellum quite a bit. There's a lot of precision, accuracy, and timing that goes into those things. Something else that the cerebellum does is that it helps to maintain our balance, our equilibrium. So that also kind of goes along with fine-tuning muscle movements. How are you going to walk if you have no sense of balance? So the cerebellum works with our balance sense, which is located in our ear, and helps us to maintain that. There's a condition called ataxia that occurs when the cerebellum is damaged. Ataxia is muscle incoordination due to damage to the cerebellum. This damage could be caused by trauma, stroke, or even alcohol. And basically, when the cerebellum is damaged, we lose that inability to fine-tune muscle movements, and we kind of lose our balance. Next, I want to talk about the diencephalon. The diencephalon is composed of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and some other brain areas. So here we see the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Okay. And the area in the box is the diencephalon. Well, there's more than that too. Actually, back here would be part of it too. So first, just to mention the thalamus. The thalamus is said to be the gateway to the cerebrum. Basically, any sensory information, with the exception of olfaction, has to be processed by the thalamus before it makes its way to the cerebral cortex. I kind of think of it this way. Lots of people write letters and send email to the president, but the president doesn't read every single letter that is sent to him. Someone has the job of going through the mail of the president and deciding which things are important and need to go on to the president and which things aren't important and the president just doesn't need to know about. And that's kind of what the thalamus is doing. It's deciding which little bits of sensory information are important enough to send to the cerebral cortex and which things doesn't the cerebral cortex need to know. Like, for instance, if the skin on your feet keeps sending signals to your brain saying, you're wearing socks, you're wearing socks, you're wearing socks, you're wearing socks. Obviously, your cerebral cortex doesn't need to be consciously aware every single second that you're wearing socks. So the thalamus might say, okay, we really don't need to send this on to the cerebral cortex. So it filters incoming sensory information. A notable structure of the thalamus is the intermediate mass of the thalamus. It's that thing that looks like an eye right here. It's a projection of gray matter. Some people don't really have an intermediate mass of the thalamus. Next is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is named for the fact that it lies below or inferior to the thalamus. And it's very small, but do not let its small size fool you. The hypothalamus contains lots and lots of nuclei that control many different functions. So in this picture here, all these little colored blocks are denoting the different types of nuclei in the hypothalamus, and they each have a different function. Hanging off of the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland's right here. And what connects the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus is a tube-like structure called the infundibulum. So, like I said, the hypothalamus packs a lot of punch for how small it is. It has several different functions, and I have just a few listed here. So the hypothalamus does produce hormones that travel down to the attached pituitary and then control the functions of the pituitary. For example, the hypothalamus produces growth hormone releasing hormone. And the growth hormone releasing hormone goes to the pituitary gland, where it causes the pituitary gland to release growth hormone. The hypothalamus also is our main regulatory center for autonomic control. Earlier we were talking about the medulla oblongata, and I said the medulla oblongata controls many of our autonomic body activities. That is true, but the hypothalamus also is controlling autonomic body activities, and the hypothalamus and the medulla oblongata work together to control things like heart rate, blood pressure, and gastrointestinal activities. The hypothalamus is also our main thermoregulatory center, so the hypothalamus can receive information about temperature and then make changes due to the information about the temperature. We say that the body's thermostat is located in the hypothalamus. So when you have a fever, what's happened is the thermostat's been reset to a higher temperature. The hypothalamus also helps to regulate our circadian rhythm, so it helps us with our day and night cycles. The hypothalamus is involved with memory, and it's also involved with our deep-seated drives and emotions, things like hunger, sex, and thirst. Also part of the Diencephalon is the pineal gland, which you can see right back here. So this is the choroid plexus of the third ventricle, and just down below the end of that is the pineal gland. And it secretes a hormone called melatonin. Melatonin is also involved with our circadian rhythm. So the pineal gland and the hypothalamus both work together to regulate our day and night cycles. Melatonin is very poorly understood. What we do know is that at night our melatonin levels are higher, and during the day they're lower. So that's why they think it has something to do with our day and night cycles. Actually, some people will take a melatonin supplement to help sleep. Next, I want to talk about the limbic system. The limbic system isn't just like one brain part, it's a functional grouping, so it's a lot of different brain parts that work together. And the job of the limbic system is to basically influence our emotional states. You know, your fear center is located in the amygdala of your limbic system. That's just an example. And the limbic system is also involved with memory storage and retrieval. To show a couple parts right here, this is the hippocampus of the limbic system, and the hippocampus is involved with storing our short-term memory. While we sleep, the hippocampus teaches the cerebral cortex everything that it remembered, and they think that's how we form long-term memories. And close by is the amygdala. The amygdala is highly involved with our emotional states. All right, now we're moving on to the cerebrum. The function of the cerebrum is rather complicated, as you can imagine. It controls all of our conscious thoughts and our intellectual functions. It's involved with things like our ability to make judgments and our imagination. But then it's involved with things like controlling our muscles and perceiving sensory information. In terms of its structure, the cerebrum has two hemispheres that are, for the most part, separated. They are connected through things like the white matter connections, like the corpus callosum. But for the most part, they are pretty separate. The cerebrum has several different lobes. The bumps all over the cerebrum are called gyri, gyrus for singular. And the little valleys where the bumps go down, those are called sulci or sulcus for singular. A really large sulcus is called a fissure. And the cerebrum has an outer layer and an inner layer. The outer layer is called the cerebral cortex, and that's where all the fun is. And then deeper to that is the inner layer called the cerebral medulla. So the cerebral medulla contains the white matter of the cerebrum. So this is found deep to the cerebral cortex. And it's white because, like other forms of white matter, it contains mostly myelinated axons. So these axons are sending signals from one part of the brain to another. Like I just mentioned earlier, the corpus callosum is an example. So we said that the two hemispheres of the cerebrum are for the most part separated, but things like the corpus callosum do connect them. And the corpus callosum is important because it allows communication from the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere. So here is a view of the corpus callosum, right, in a sagittal section. But kind of to give you a more three-dimensional view of the corpus callosum, here we're looking at an anterior view of the brain, and here you can very nicely see how the corpus callosum can communicate between the right and the left halves of the cerebral hemisphere. All right, most of the action, though, is happening in the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex is superficial to the cerebral medulla, so this is the outer layer of the brain, right? And it contains gray matter. In this picture here, we're looking at a brain, and you can very clearly see the darker outer layer, the cortex, that is the gray matter right here, and then the white matter would be the cerebral medulla. The gray matter is gray because it contains cell bodies which are darker and denser than axons. There might be some unmyelinated axons in here. The white matter was white because it contained a lot of fat around the outside of the axons, and fats tend to be white. So the cerebral cortex has different layers to it. In humans, we have more layers in our cerebral cortex than other animals, and that's one of the things that contributes to the human intelligence. Also, the cerebral cortex in humans has many more folds, so we have more gyri and sulci than other animals do. Basically, we have more surface area for processing information and intellectual thoughts and functions. What I think is one of the really amazing things about the cerebral cortex is the fact that the neurons that make their way to the cerebral cortex make their way to the right place. Like during embryonic development, what happens is our neurons crawl all the way to the surface of the cerebral cortex. But then once they hit the surface there, they crawl back to the right part of the cortex where they need to be and then stop, which sounds really weird because the neuron came like this, it went right past where it was supposed to be, went all the way to the surface and came back again. And that's how most of the neurons get into the correct location in the cerebral cortex. And I find it absolutely amazing that our neurons make their way to the right places most of the time, and most of the time everything works out just fine. We have the cerebral cortex pretty well mapped. We know which areas of the cerebral cortex are involved with what. Right? Like for instance in the woman, apparently there's a large area for love as compared to sex for the man. Just joking. All right, so I want to talk about the functions of the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex is involved with a lot of different functions. It's involved with our ability to perceive sensory information and make sense of that information. It's involved with sending out motor commands to control our muscles. It's involved with emotions and language. Right? So it helps us to not only understand language, but produce language. It's involved with sleep, memory, and cognition. So we'll first talk about how the cerebral cortex is involved with senses. There are two main groups of senses in the human body, special senses and general senses. Special senses are limited to the head and they employ complex organs. They include gustation, which is taste, olfaction, which is smell, vision, hearing, and balance. Touch is not considered a special sense. So I know K through 12 education teaches children that touch is a special sense, but from a human anatomy and physiology perspective, touch is not considered to be a special sense. Touch would fall into the next category, which are general senses. General senses, it would be nice if we could just call them general senses, but there's a lot of different names for general senses. Somesthetic, somatosensory, and somatic are a couple examples. Som means body and aesthetic means to sense. So basically, these are the senses that are of most of our body. So things like touch you can feel all over your body, and temperature you can detect all over your body, and pain you can detect all over your body. So I want to take a look at how the cerebral cortex is involved with sensation. Sensation is perceived in a two-step process within the cerebral cortex. It involves two different areas of the cortex, something called the primary cortex and then something called an association area. The job of the primary cortex is to initially receive the sensory information that's coming into the brain. So when information hits a primary cortex, we become aware of the sensation. So we know we're feeling something, but we don't know what it is that we're feeling. From there, the information will be sent to the nearby association area of the cortex. When the information hits the association area, that's when we make cognitive sense of the information. That's when we go, aha, I know what I'm feeling blank. Like for example, so let's take for example a pebble in your shoe. Okay, so a pebble gets into your shoe, it's going to activate pain receptors in your skin. Those signals will be sent up a nerve to your spinal cord, up your spinal cord, through your brainstem to your thalamus. And remember, your thalamus has the job of filtering incoming sensory information. This sounds like a pretty important thing, so the thalamus sends the information out to the cerebral cortex. The first place the thalamus is going to send the information to is going to be a primary area of the cortex, where you'll become aware that there is something uncomfortable on the bottom of your foot. From there, the information will be sent to a nearby association area where you go, aha, there must be a pebble in my shoe. You make cognitive sense of the information. So let's first take a look at how the cerebral cortex is involved with general senses. The primary cortex that's involved with general senses is called the primary somesthetic cortex. The primary somesthetic cortex is located right here. This is a location called the postcentral gyrus. This little area right here is called the central sulcus. This dip right here is the central sulcus. In front of the sulcus is the precentral gyrus, and behind the sulcus is the postcentral gyrus. So the primary somesthetic cortex is located in the postcentral gyrus, and when any kind of general sensory information is sent to the cortex, it goes here first. From the primary somesthetic cortex, it will then be sent over here to this nearby association area called the somesthetic association area, a rather large area of the brain. This little picture is something called a sensory homunculus, and a homunculus takes a part of the brain and then maps the body to it. So what we're looking at here is a sensory homunculus of the postcentral gyrus. So the dark purple here, okay, that would be this area here. So this is the postcentral gyrus of the cerebral cortex. Right? The size of the body part associated with that part of the brain gives us some information about how sensitive we are to feeling general sensory information from that particular body part. For example, according to this map, you can perceive a lot more general sensory information at your tongue than you can from your elbow. Right? Your lips are much more sensitive than your wrist, kind of thing. So now I want to look at how the cerebral cortex is involved with special senses. So again, there's a two-step process involving a primary cortex and an association area. But we won't be using the somesthetic cortex or the somesthetic association area here. Remember, somesthetic means general senses. And now we're moving on to special senses. So we're going to use primary sensory cortices here that are named for the particular special sense. And then we'll use association areas here that are also named for the special sense. But the pattern's going to be the same. The information will be processed through the thalamus and then sent to the primary cortex, where we become aware of the sensation, and then it will be sent to the association area, where we make cognitive sense of it. For example, when you see something with your eye, the information is first sent to the primary visual cortex, where you become aware that you are seeing something. You're seeing light, you're seeing a pattern to the light, but you don't know what it is yet. The information needs to be sent next to this green area here, which is the visual association area. Once the information hits this green area, you can make cognitive sense of it and say, aha, there's a bird flying at my head and I should probably duck, kind of thing. Another example, this darker orange area right here is our primary auditory cortex, which first receives our hearing information at the cortex. And that's when we become aware that we're hearing something, but we don't know what it is that we're hearing until the information is sent over here to the auditory association area. All right, so let's take a look at a couple pathways to sensation. So I kind of already went over this, but I think it's worth it to go over it again. I want to look at how we can feel a pebble in our shoe. Well, first, a sensory receptor in the foot is activated. That sends a signal through a spinal nerve to the spinal cord. It goes through the spinal cord up to the brainstem, through the brainstem to the thalamus. The thalamus then will send the information on to the primary somesthetic cortex, right? Because this is not a special sense, so we're using the somesthetic cortex. And then the information is sent to the somesthetic association area. And that's when we are able to make cognitive sense of the fact that this bumpy thing in the bottom of our foot is a pebble in our shoe, and we should probably take our shoe off to fix it. But now, here's a pathway that we didn't talk about, tasting cake, right? That's always a fun thing to do. So the first thing that happens is we put the cake in our mouth and we activate gustatory receptors on our tongue. A signal is then sent through a cranial nerve to the brainstem, through the brainstem to the thalamus. This is very, very, very important information. So the thalamus must send it on to the primary gustatory cortex, where you become aware that you are tasting something. But then the information is sent to the gustatory association area, where you realize that you are tasting delicious cake and you really need to get some more of that delicious cake. Now we're going to take a look at motor control, how the cerebral cortex is involved with motor control. With sensory perception that we just talked about, sensory perception ended at the cerebral cortex. But with motor control, we're going to begin the controlling of our muscles. We're going to begin that at the cerebral cortex. Just like with sensory information processing at the cortex, we will go through a two-step process here for motor control. And we're going to use a primary cortex and an association area. But we do it in reverse. We're going to use the association area first and then the primary cortex. So there's a two-step process to motor control. The motor association area of the brain is where we plan out our motor commands. When you go, aha, I think I want to wave my hands in the air like I just don't care. Okay, so you begin that planning in the motor association area. From there, the information is sent to the primary from there the information is sent to the primary motor cortex, which is in the precentral gyrus. I'm going to start all over again. So again, this is a two-step process through the cortex. So we start off the planning of a motor command at the motor association area, which is located in the frontal lobe of the cerebral cortex. So this is where we decide and make the plan to move a muscle. So if you decide you want to throw your hands in the air like you just don't care, that plan starts here in the motor association area. From there, the information will be sent to the primary motor cortex at the precentral gyrus. And from there, the signal will be sent down to other parts of the brain and then eventually out to the muscle. Now there's many brain structures that are going to be involved with fine-tuning a motor signal before it's actually sent out to the muscle. For example, the brainstem could be involved, the cerebellum, which of course is highly involved with precision and control of muscles, would likely be involved too. So in light blue, we see the motor association area where motor signals start. This is when we plan out a motor command. From there, the information is sent to the precentral gyrus, our primary motor cortex, and then it will be sent to other brain areas such as the cerebellum. I know it says sensation up here, but it should be motor. We looked at a sensory homunculus earlier. This is a motor homunculus, right? So we're looking at the precentral gyrus. So this is the mapping of the precentral gyrus, right? The larger the body part, the more control we have over the body part. For instance, we have much more fine control over our fingers than we do our hips. Apparently a lot of control of our tongue. So I taught you how to feel a pebble in your shoe, and I taught you how to taste cake, so let's eat some soup now. Okay? The idea to move muscles to eat soup begins in the motor association area of the cerebral cortex. From there, the information is sent to the primary motor cortex. After the primary motor cortex, the signal is sent to other brain areas like your brainstem and cerebellum. Then the information will be sent down your spinal cord, to a spinal nerve, to your biceps brachii muscle. Your biceps brachii muscle will flex, helping you to bring your spoon towards your mouth so you can eat soup. The next function of the cerebral cortex I want to talk about is emotion. Now, the area of the cerebral cortex that's involved with emotion is at the prefrontal cortex, so that's the very, very front of your brain, right behind your forehead. And the prefrontal cortex helps you to make judgments. It's involved with your intent and control over the expression of your emotions. So your ability to not go completely crazy when you get angry, right, would be an example of the prefrontal cortex working to help you control the expression of your emotions. Now, emotions arise from other areas of the brain. Emotions don't arise from the prefrontal cortex. They arise from places like the hypothalamus and the amygdala. So I gave the example of fear earlier. Fear arises from the amygdala, but our ability to control our fears from the prefrontal cortex. The picture below is of a gentleman called Phineas Gage. And Phineas Gage was a foreman that worked on building railroads quite some time ago. And he's very famous for the fact that a railroad spike went right through his prefrontal cortex. As you can see in the picture here, it went actually behind his eye and up through his skull, damaging his prefrontal cortex. What's amazing about this is the fact that he lived, first of all. He actually walked part of the way to the doctors after this happened, though he did get a little bit of a ride on a cart. And he was talking throughout the whole thing, and like I said, he lived. And so that in itself was pretty phenomenal. But he changed because of this accident. We know some things about the prefrontal cortex in part because of Phineas Gage's accident. We now know that the prefrontal cortex is involved with things like controlling our emotions. Before the accident, Phineas Gage was described as being a very wonderful, kind, gentle man. And then after the accident, his personality changed, and he progressively became more and more aggressive and angry, demonstrating things like an inability to control the expression of his emotions. The accident didn't kill him initially, but ultimately it did in the end. The cerebral cortex is also involved with language. There are two particular areas of the brain that are highly involved with language. Wernicke area and Broca area, or sometimes called Wernicke's area and Broca's area. The Wernicke area is involved with our understanding of language. You know, the fact that you can actually understand the words coming out of my mouth right now means that your Wernicke's area is working fine. You know, if you can read the words on the screen and understand them, then your Wernicke's area is working. If the Wernicke's area becomes damaged, someone can experience what's known as Wernicke's aphasia. So this can happen like from a stroke, for example. If someone has Wernicke's aphasia, they have an inability to comprehend language, and they usually have an inability to speak appropriately meaningful words. Individuals with Wernicke's aphasia often have very fluent speech. It has that natural sing-songy kind of nature that speech has, but they're speaking complete nonsense and gibberish. Like, you can ask someone who has Wernicke's aphasia, like, where do you work? And so what I just said was a bunch of nonsense, but it had like a sing-songy nature to it, right? I seemed confident in what I was saying, right? But it wasn't making any sense. And that's an example of Wernicke's aphasia. The other area of the brain involved with language is Broca's area, which is involved with making language, our ability to speak meaningful words and produce language. If the Broca's area is damaged, then speech becomes difficult to initiate, and it's usually not very fluent, often halting. So individuals with Broca's aphasia have a hard time getting words out. You can ask them a simple question like, where do you work? And they'll pause and maybe say, and then eventually they might get out a one-word answer like school, right? So they are producing meaningful words, but it's very broken, it's not fluent, it's hard to initiate, kind of thing. The cerebral cortex is also involved with sleep. What is sleep exactly? Okay. What is sleep? If a child asked you, what is sleep? How would you describe that? It's sort of a hard thing to describe, right? It's when we become unconscious for a very long period of our day, right? We're not moving, right? It's different from hibernation and coma. Someone who's in a coma can't be aroused when you're sleeping. You can be aroused through sensory input. Hibernation is a completely different ballgame altogether. But why do we have to sleep? Why do we sleep? How much time do we spend sleeping? How much of our life do we sleep? Right? We spend a third of our life asleep. That's a lot. 33% of your whole entire life, you are unconscious. Why? Why are you unconscious for 33% of your life? Because you need to? Yes, but why? Why do we need to sleep? Because we need rest? Well, fine. Just let me kick back on my sofa for 8 hours a day. You know, I can rest there, right? I won't move. I'll just put my laptop on my lap and get some work done. I'm not going to be moving though. Our brain needs rest. Maybe that's, the true reason is that our brain needs to be able to shut down and recover. What's interesting though is that the brain is very active during certain parts of sleep. You've probably heard that there's REM sleep and non-REM sleep. REM stands for rapid eye movement. So when we sleep, we cycle through several different phases of REM and non-REM sleep. You might go through like 5 or 6 different phases of REM and non-REM sleep during one sleeping period. If we measure brain activity during REM sleep, the brain is very active, right? There's a big joke that students' brains are more active when they sleep than they are in an anatomy and physiology class, right? But your brain is very active during REM sleep. During non-REM sleep, the brain is less active. They think during non-REM sleep, that's more of the restorative kind of sleep. That's when our brain is truly resting up, not using a lot of energy. But during REM sleep, our brain is obviously doing something, but why? They think one of the things that's happening during REM sleep is that we are developing long-term memory. So I mentioned before that the hippocampus stores our short-term memory. And while we sleep, we see some communication happening between the hippocampus and the cerebral cortex. And we think that the hippocampus is teaching the cerebral cortex long-term memory. Which things from your day are important to keep and store away for later, and which things can be thrown out. And of course, as I just said, memory is an important component of the cerebral cortex. The last thing I want to talk about with regards to the cerebral cortex is cognition. Cognition is knowing. right? And it's the least understood aspect of the cerebral cortex. It's the range of mental processes by which we obtain knowledge. So what I'm saying is that we know the least about how we know things, which is kind of weird. Cognition happens all over the cerebral cortex, right? Those sensory association areas we were talking about, that were helping us make cognitive sense of things, right? That was cognition happening, right? The prefrontal cortex of the frontal lobe, when it helps us to control our anger, that's cognition, right? The prefrontal cortex of the frontal lobe is highly involved with many aspects of cognition, like your ability to predict consequences. Like, if I don't study for my anatomy and physiology test, I will probably do bad. Right? If you can make a prediction like that, then your prefrontal cortex is working properly, right? At least in some aspects. I want to talk for a second about frontal lobotomies. You've probably heard of this procedure before. Thousands and thousands of frontal lobotomies were done here in the United States in the 1940s mostly. And most of them were done by Dr. Walter Freeman and Dr. James Watts. A frontal lobotomy was said to be a procedure where connections in the frontal lobe were severed. But this was before we had any proper imaging techniques, so in reality I don't think they had any idea what exactly they were doing. The procedure involved using a ice pick-like structure that was inserted into the corner of the eye. So it didn't go right through the eyeball, but it went through the corner of the eye and then penetrated through the skull bones behind the eye and went into the frontal cortex. And then basically this ice pick-like structure was scrambled around in the frontal lobe to sever connections. And these frontal lobotomies were done to treat a whole rainbow of things. They were done mostly on institutionalized patients. So back in the 1940s, it was very common for off individuals to be placed in an institution. And Dr. Freeman kind of advertised this procedure as a way to cure a lot of these people from their particular disorders. And actually it was the United States government that funded most of the frontal lobotomies that he performed, because it was a cheap procedure. It was really cheap. It could be done with very little or sometimes no anesthetic, and it was sort of like a cheap, fast fix. Problem was, it didn't really fix anything. Oddly enough, it did sometimes supposedly cure some individuals, but in many other individuals it made things much worse. A famous case of a frontal lobotomy was done on a Kennedy. So JFK had a sister very few people have heard of named Rosemary Kennedy. And Rosemary Kennedy was had atypical behaviors. You know, first of all, she was a Kennedy, right? And if you're a Kennedy, you have to be perfect. And Rosemary Kennedy was not perfect. You know, she was very rebellious, and her family didn't like that. We don't really have a lot of information on Rosemary Kennedy. What we think is that Rosemary Kennedy might have been labeled with what we would now call autism. She might have had a mild case of autism. She did appear to have lower cognitive ability, so she did have a slightly lower than normal IQ. But she was a Kennedy, and you know, this was not acceptable. So her parents had a frontal lobotomy performed on her, and then she basically became a vegetable after that. And her sister Eunice Kennedy Shriver started the Special Olympics actually in her honor. The last thing I want to talk about is Alzheimer's disease. This is a really great picture depicting what happens to the brain during Alzheimer's disease. The brain over here on the left is a normal brain seen in coronal section. You can see the cerebral cortex, the gray matter, and the white matter. The white matter is the cerebral medulla. Here we have the corpus callosum. We can see part of our ventricles here and here. This curly structure is the hippocampus, of course important in memory. And over here we see the brain from an individual with Alzheimer's disease. Immediately you notice there's a massive loss of tissue overall. So we've lost brain tissue. Some of that loss is because the brain tissue is gone, but some of the loss is due to the fact that the brain ventricles have gotten highly enlarged. Look how big these ventricles are, comparatively speaking. They're gigantic, right? Also, the hippocampus much, much smaller, right? If you think about the symptoms of, oops, if you think about the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, obviously memory loss is one of them. So this is a PET scan. On the left side of the screen, we have PET scan from normal individuals without Alzheimer's disease, and over here we see the PET scans of individuals with Alzheimer's disease. And let's just say blue is bad, okay? The blue indicates low glucose usage, which means possibly dead brain tissue. When they look at the cell biology of Alzheimer's disease, they notice two things, tangles and plaques. Tangles are conglomerates of molecules inside of neurons, whereas the plaques are found outside of neurons. And they don't exactly know why these things form or what they're doing, but those are not seen in individuals that do not have Alzheimer's disease. And for a long time, they were targeting drugs for Alzheimer's disease towards these tangles and plaques. They thought, well, if we can make a drug that could prevent or break down the plaques and tangles, perhaps we can actually treat the Alzheimer's disease, because as of right now, there is no known treatment for Alzheimer's disease. So they started doing this research on drugs to combat the plaques and tangles, and what they found out was that they think these things might actually be helping to prevent Alzheimer's disease. That when someone first starts to develop Alzheimer's disease, that the plaques and tangles may actually be a defense against the disease getting worse. So now they're back to square one. They really have no idea how to treat this disease at all.